The moment Maggie Rhodes let slip that she had never once had a birthday cake, Alfred Redmond set down his coffee cup with such deliberate care that the whole world seemed to hold its breath alongside him. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Callow Creek, Texas, sat baking beneath an October sun that had not yet decided whether it belonged to summer or fall. Dust curled lazily up from the main street where horses stood tethered to hitching posts, flicking their tails at flies that buzzed with the same unhurried persistence that characterized nearly everything in that part of the country. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing with it a general store that smelled of cedar and tobacco, a telegraph office that crackled with news from far-off places, a schoolhouse painted the particular shade of white that always managed to turn yellow by the following spring, and enough new settlers to triple the population of what had once been nothing more than a way station for cattle drives heading north. Alfred Redmond had arrived in Callow Creek 3 years before all of that, when the town was still rough and unfinished, when the saloon had no proper floor, and the church held services under a canvas awning. He had come with nothing more than a good horse, a battered saddle, a reputation for being the finest cattle hand south of the Red River, and a quietness about him that people sometimes mistook for coldness, until they had known him long enough to understand that it was simply how a man looked when he had learned to carry his sorrows without making them everyone else's burden. He was 28 years old that October, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that outdoor work made a man, with dark hair that needed cutting and green eyes that caught the light in a way that had caused more than one woman in Callow Creek to lose her train of thought mid-sentence. He worked for a rancher named Gus Holt, who ran a spread of about 4,000 acres east of town, and who treated Alfred with the particular respect that men reserve for someone who is genuinely good at something that matters. Alfred could read weather in cloud formations, could bring a spooked horse down to calm with nothing more than a low voice and a steady hand, and could doctor a sick calf back to health with a confidence that bordered on the miraculous. He was, by every measure that Callow Creek used to judge a man, one of the best among them. But he was also lonely in a way that he would never have said out loud, not to Gus, not to the other hands, not to anyone. Maggie Rhodes had come to Callow Creek 6 months ago, hired as a schoolteacher after the previous one had left to marry a banker in San Antonio. She was 24 years old, slight and serious, with auburn hair that she wore pinned up so severely it seemed like a statement of intention, and brown eyes so dark they were almost black, eyes that observed everything with an intensity that made some of the children in her classroom shift uncomfortably in their seats before they came to understand that the intensity was not judgment but genuine interest. She had grown up in Missouri, the only child of a father who drank and a mother who had died when Maggie was 7 years old, and she had educated herself with a ferocity that still surprised her when she thought about it, borrowing books from anyone who would lend them, teaching herself grammar and mathematics and history by candlelight after her father had gone to bed, eventually earning a teaching certificate at 21 through the kind of sheer stubborn effort that nobody who had not lived her life could quite understand. She was not what most people in Callow Creek would have called pretty at first glance. She was too serious for that, too contained, too watchful. But there was something about her that stayed with you after you had spoken to her, something that made a conversation with Maggie Rhodes feel like it had mattered in a way that most conversations did not. And the children in her classroom adored her with a fierceness that their parents found both touching and slightly alarming. Alfred had first spoken to her at the general store in late April, when she had been trying to carry 3 books, a bag of rice, and a bolt of plain blue fabric all at once, and had dropped everything simultaneously. And he had been walking past and had simply stopped and helped her pick it all up, and she had thanked him with the sort of direct, unsentimental courtesy that had made him pay attention. He had asked what the books were, because they were heavy enough that he was curious, and she had told him one was a geography text she was using for the older students. One was a novel by Dickens that was for herself, and one was a primer she was repairing with her own money because the school could not afford a replacement. He had looked at her for a moment with those green eyes of his, and said that it seemed like the school board ought to be buying its own primers, and she had said with perfect composure that the school board agreed with everything she did as long as she did not ask them for money. And he had laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him, and she had smiled, and it had been brief and unremarkable, and he had thought about it for the next 3 days. After that they had spoken whenever circumstance put them in the same place, which in a town the size of Callow Creek happened with a frequency that felt less like coincidence and more like the town itself was collaborating. They spoke at the general store, at the church social in June, at the town meeting about the water rights dispute in July, at the 4th of July celebration where someone's fireworks had gone badly sideways and Alfred had helped put out a small grass fire while Maggie had organized the children to safety with a calm authority that he had found genuinely impressive. They were not courting, exactly. He had not called on her formally, had not spoken to anyone about his intentions, had not done any of the things that were expected of a man who was interested in a woman in 1882. He was, if he was honest with himself, afraid of her a little, not because she was formidable, though she was, but because she mattered to him in a way that made the possibility of failure feel genuinely unbearable. The day the birthday thing came out was a Tuesday in the second week of October. Alfred had come into town to pick up a supply order for Gus at the general store, and Maggie had been there buying ink for the schoolhouse, and the store's owner, a cheerful round-faced man named Bert Cowley, had been in the middle of decorating the front of his counter with a paper banner, because his wife had a birthday the following day, and he was telling anyone who would listen how he planned to close the store at noon and throw her a party that the whole street could hear. Maggie had listened to Bert's enthusiastic description of the cake his sister-in-law was baking, and the fiddle player he had hired, and the way he intended to hang paper lanterns along the porch. And there had been something in her expression, something small and quickly suppressed, that Alfred had caught because he had been watching her the way he always watched her, with the attentive care of someone who has decided, however quietly, that a particular person is worth paying attention to. "Have you got a birthday coming up yourself, Miss Rhodes?" Bert had asked cheerfully, because Bert asked everyone everything and took great pleasure in doing so. "The 15th, she had said pleasantly without particular feeling, glancing at the ink bottles Bert had set out for her. "Why, that's just 2 weeks off," Bert had said. "You planning anything?" And Maggie had looked up briefly and said, in a tone so matter-of-fact it could have broken something, "I never have. Birthdays were not something we marked in my family. I would not know what to do with one." And then she had picked up her ink, paid Bert with exact coins from a small leather purse, thanked him, and left, and Bert had already moved on to talking about the thickness of the cake batter, and Alfred had stood very still by the supply crates with the weight of what she had just said settling over him like a blanket being pulled tight. She had never had a birthday celebration, not once in 24 years. And she had said it the way you say something that you have made peace with, the way you say a fact about the weather or the price of flour, with a quietness that told him it was not peace at all but the thing that lives in the place where peace has been practicing to look like itself. He picked up Gus's supplies. He loaded them onto the wagon. He drove back out to the Holt Ranch on a road he could have driven blindfolded, and he was so thoroughly inside his own thoughts that he nearly missed the turn at the cottonwood tree that he had made 1,000 times before. He thought about what it would mean to have gone 24 years without a single person thinking enough of you to mark the day you came into the world. He thought about her father, the drinking man in Missouri, and he thought about her mother gone when she was 7, and he thought about the image of a young girl educating herself by candlelight, and he felt something move in his chest that was not quite sorrow and not quite anger and was not quite tenderness either, but some complicated combination of all three that had no name he knew. By the time he pulled the wagon into the yard at the Holt Ranch, he had made a decision. He was going to give Maggie Rhodes a birthday, whether she had asked for one or not. He told Gus about it that evening over supper in the ranch house kitchen, because Alfred was not a man who made plans in secret when he could be honest about them, and also because he needed Gus's permission to take some time off in the next 2 weeks to organize things properly. Gus Holt was a weathered 50-year-old widower who had seen enough of life to know when something mattered, and he looked at Alfred across the table for a long moment and then said, "You've been sweet on that schoolteacher since April, haven't you?" It was not a question. Alfred said, "I have." Gus said, "Then go organize your birthday party and stop letting it eat at you," and helped himself to more biscuits, and that was that. The next morning, Alfred rode into Callow Creek before the sun was fully up, when the sky was still that particular shade of dark blue that exists between night and morning, when the dust was cool and the horses were quiet in their stalls. He went first to the church, because the Reverend Dale Morrow was always up early, a habit left over from his farming days before he had found his calling, and Reverend Morrow listened to Alfred's plan with his hands folded on his kitchen table and his expression thoughtful. "The 15th, you said," the Reverend said. "Yes, sir. That's a Saturday this year." Alfred had already known this. He had thought it was a sign, though he was not generally a man who believed in signs. "I would like to use the church social hall," Alfred said, "if you would permit it." Reverend Morrow looked at him steadily. "Does she know you're doing this?" "No, sir." There was a long pause. "And you're certain she'd want it?" Alfred thought about the way Maggie's expression had looked in that moment in the store, that small and quickly suppressed thing, and he said, "I think she has never let herself want it, because she thought nobody would ever give it to her. But I think the wanting has always been there." Reverend Morrow nodded slowly, the way men nod when they have decided something. "You can have the hall," he said, "and my wife will help. She loves any excuse to cook." From the church, Alfred went to the bakery. There was no dedicated bakery in Callow Creek, but Clara Finch ran a baking operation out of her house on the east side of Main Street, supplying pies and bread and occasional cakes to households throughout the town, and Clara was the sort of woman who treated any request as a welcome challenge. Alfred explained what he needed, and Clara sat down at her kitchen table with a pencil stub and began writing things on the back of a flour sack, nodding to herself with the businesslike enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for exactly this project without knowing it. "Chocolate layer cake," Clara said firmly. "None of your plain vanilla for a birthday. It wants to be chocolate. And I will put sugar flowers on top, the kind that take 3 days to make properly." "You will need to give me my 3 days." "You have 12, Alfred said. Clara looked up at him with bright, pleased eyes. "In 12 days I can make her a cake that will be remembered in this town for 20 years, she said. He went next to the general store, where Bert Cowley had finished with his own wife's birthday decorations, and was in his regular morning state of good humor. Alfred explained the situation, including the part about Maggie never having had a celebration, and watched Bert's cheerful face cycle through surprise, something approaching outrage, and then resolve into a particular expression of determined goodwill that Alfred had come to recognize as Bert's planning face. "Paper lanterns," Bert said immediately. "I have 20 in the back room, blue and gold and ribbon. And I have got a bolt of that ivory cotton muslin that I could make into table dressing if your Clara Finch will hem it, because she sews faster than anyone I know." "I will ask her," Alfred said. "And I will give it all it cost," Bert said, with the air of a man making a grand gesture. "No, I will give the lanterns as a gift. She teaches my children and she charges less for the evening reading classes than anyone ought to. The lanterns are a gift." By mid-morning, Alfred had also spoken to Pete Navarro. the Mexican-born musician who played fiddle and guitar at the saloon on weekends, and who had an absolute genius for making a room feel celebratory. And to me, Hendrix, who ran the boarding house where Maggie herself lived and who turned out, when Alfred arrived at her door, to already be half convinced there was something worth celebrating in the offing, because she had been watching the way Alfred looked at Maggie for 6 months and had been waiting patiently for the boy to do something about it. Me was a 55-year-old woman of remarkable energy and very direct speech, and she grabbed Alfred's arm when he told her what he was planning and said, with a kind of compressed ferocity, "That girl went to sleep on every one of her birthdays like it was just a regular Tuesday. And I knew, and I did not do anything about it last year, and it has been sitting on my conscience since May. So you tell me what you need and I will move heaven and earth to give it to you." Alfred told her what he needed, which was primarily that she keep Maggie occupied on the morning of the 15th so that the decorating could happen at the church hall without Maggie seeing it, and me nodded with the determination of a woman who has decided the outcome before the plan has even properly formed. "I will tell her I need help with my ledgers," me said. "She has helped me with them before. She will not suspect a thing. And one more thing," Alfred said and paused. "Do not tell her who organized this." Me looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite sympathy, but something that lived in the territory between them. "She is going to figure it out, Alfred," she said gently. "I know," Alfred said, "but I would like her to figure it out herself." Over the following days, Alfred worked the ranch in the mornings and organized the birthday celebration in the afternoons and evenings with a focus that Gus watched with quiet approval. The word spread through Callow Creek, the way word always spread in small towns, which is to say simultaneously in all directions at once, and people responded with a warmth that Alfred had hoped for but had not quite counted on. Frank Alderman, who was the blacksmith, said he would come and bring his wife and his 3 sons. The Abbott family, who ran the mill, sent word that they would bring enough corn bread for 40 people. Dr. Samuel Pierce said he would come and would bring a bottle of good brandy that had been sitting in his cabinet since his wife's last birthday. And when Alfred looked at him with a question in his eyes, the doctor said simply, "She died 3 years ago, and the bottle needs drinking by someone who is celebrating something." I think that is what she would have wanted. The Vasquez family, who had a farm 2 miles south of town, and were among the earliest Spanish land-grant families in that part of Texas, sent word through their eldest son that Senora Vasquez would come early to help decorate and would bring tamales, which she made better than anyone for 100 miles in any direction, and which she only made for occasions that deserved them. The Harmon sisters, Delia and Ruth, who were 19 and 22 and helped their mother at the laundry, offered to braid wildflower garlands because they had seen it done at a wedding in San Antonio the previous summer and had been looking for an excuse to try it. Even old Amos Craw, who was 73 years old and generally regarded as the most reliably disagreeable man in Callow Creek, having voiced a strong opinion against every communal event in recent memory, stopped Alfred on the street and said, with a gruffness that did not entirely conceal his sincerity, "I heard what you are doing for the schoolteacher. That is a decent thing. I will come, and I will be polite about it." Alfred thanked him with a straight face. The days between his decision and the 15th were not only occupied with party planning, though. They were also occupied with Maggie herself, with the daily small accumulations of time spent near her that were, Alfred was beginning to understand, the actual architecture of what was happening between them. On the Wednesday before the 15th, he met her by accident at the well at the edge of town, where she had gone to fill a bucket for the schoolhouse's potted herb garden, and he had gone because one of the ranch's water barrels needed filling from the town supply. They worked side by side at the well for 20 minutes in a comfortable quiet that felt easy in the way that comfortable quiet only feels when you have earned it, and then Maggie said, without looking up from her bucket, "There is something different about you this week." Alfred said, "Is there?" which was not quite a question. "You have the look of a man who is planning something," she said. She pulled the bucket from the well hook and set it at her feet and looked at him then, and her dark eyes were as direct and unguarded as always. "What are you planning?" "Nothing that would trouble you," he said, which was true and not at all an answer, and he gave her what he thought was a perfectly composed expression, and she looked at him for a moment longer with that intensity of hers and then said, "You are a terrible liar, Alfred Redmond," and picked up her bucket and walked back toward the schoolhouse, and he stood at the well watching her go and trying very hard not to smile. On the Thursday, he found her at the evening reading class. She held 3 nights a week at the schoolhouse for the adults in town who had not had the chance to learn in childhood. She was working with a man named Douglas Crane, who was 40 years old and had grown up on a farm where education was considered a luxury they could not afford, and who had shown up at Maggie's class in June with the sort of pride-swallowing courage that only certain kinds of people can manage. And Alfred had stopped in the doorway to return a book he had borrowed 2 weeks earlier, and had stood there for a moment watching her guide Douglas through a paragraph, her voice patient and specific, never making him feel small, always finding what was right about what he had done before she addressed what needed correction. Alfred left the book on the table near the door and went out without interrupting her, but she had seen him from the corner of her eye, and she came out after him when Douglas was practicing on his own, and caught him at the bottom of the schoolhouse steps in the blue evening air. "You did not have to leave so quickly," she said. "I did not want to interrupt," he said. She looked at him in the gathering dark. The lamp inside the schoolhouse cast a rectangle of warm light through the open door and touched the edges of her hair, and Alfred thought, with a clarity that was almost dizzying, that he had never in his life wanted anything as straightforwardly as he wanted to court this woman properly and tell her so directly. "Alfred," she said, with that composure of hers that was never cold, that was always simply thoughtful, "are you going to tell me what it is that you have been thinking about all week?" "Not yet," he said. She considered this. "Will you tell me eventually?" "Yes," he said. She seemed to accept this with the patience that was characteristic of her, the patience of someone who has learned to wait without knowing they were waiting. "All right," she said. "Then I will wait." And she went back inside to Douglas and his paragraph, and Alfred rode back to the Holt Ranch under a sky full of stars, and thought about Saturday with the focused intensity of a man who has staked something important on a particular outcome. Friday arrived in the way that the days before significant things always arrive, slightly faster than all the preceding days, and with an unreasonable number of small problems packed into it. Alfred spent the morning at the ranch dealing with a section of fence that had come down overnight and a yearling calf that had gotten itself stuck in the creek bank mud. And by noon, he had mud to his knees and a scratch on his forearm from a fence wire, and a strong feeling that the universe was testing his commitment. In the afternoon, he rode into Callow Creek and spent 3 hours at the church hall with Bert Cowley and Senora Vasquez and the Harmon sisters, hanging paper lanterns and draping ivory muslin on trestle tables, and arranging wildflower garlands along the windowsills and the doorframe in a cascade of yellow and white, and the last remaining purple of the season. Clara Finch arrived at 4 o'clock with the cake on a board, covered with a cloth, and when she unveiled it, Alfred stood back and looked at it and said nothing for a moment because it was, by any honest measure, a remarkable thing. 3 layers of dark chocolate, with cream frosting between each layer and over the top and sides, and on the surface a landscape of white sugar flowers, roses and daisies and small star-shaped blossoms, arranged with a precision that made it look more like art than food. In the center, Clara had written in careful letters with a piping of pale blue sugar, "For Maggie, first of many." Alfred read it and felt the back of his throat tighten in a way that he had not expected and would have been embarrassed to explain. "It is perfect," he said, and Clara, who was a practical woman not given to sentimentality, looked quietly pleased. Pete Navarro came at 5 to look over the space and discuss where he would set up, and he brought his guitar as well as his fiddle, and said he had been working on a waltz arrangement that he thought suited the occasion, and played a few bars of it in the empty hall with the late afternoon light coming through the lantern-hung windows, and even the Reverend Morrow, who had wandered in with a broom and stayed to listen, stopped sweeping and simply stood there. That evening, Alfred went to me's boarding house and knocked on the front door and asked to speak with Maggie, and me answered and gave him a look that communicated about 14 different things simultaneously, most of them involving impatience, and called back into the house for Maggie, and then withdrew with the studied casualness of someone who is definitely going to stay just inside the doorway and listen. Maggie came to the door in a plain gray dress with her hair partially down, which he had never seen before, and she looked at him with the particular expression she wore when something had caught her genuine attention. "Miss Rhodes," he said, and then stopped, because he had planned what he was going to say on the ride over, and now that he was standing in front of her in the soft porch light of an October evening, it had all left him completely. "Yes," she said, and there was the faintest trace of something in her voice, not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it, something warm. "I would like to ask you to come to the church hall tomorrow morning," he said. "About 10 o'clock. She looked at him steadily. "Tomorrow is the 15th, she said. "I know. My birthday. I know." A silence opened between them, not uncomfortable but full. She was looking at him with those dark eyes of hers, and he held her gaze and let her look as long as she needed to. "Alfred," she said finally, quietly, "what have you done?" "I have not done anything yet," he said. "Come at 10 o'clock and see." She was quiet for another moment, and he watched something move through her expression, something he could not name exactly, something that looked like the inside of a held breath. Then she said, "All right," and her voice was very even, the way it was when she was working hardest at composure, and he said good night and went back to his horse and rode back to the ranch feeling something he was reasonably certain was happiness, though it was large enough that he was not entirely sure he was accustomed to it. The morning of October 15th, 1882, arrived cold and clear, with a sky the deep saturated blue that only comes in the high autumn in Texas, when the heat has finally relented, and the air has a sharpness to it that smells like cedar and dry grass, and something that might almost be the approaching winter if you knew where to look for it. Alfred was up before dawn, dressed in his good clothes, the dark shirt and the vest he wore to church and the boots he polished only for important occasions, and he rode into Callow Creek at 7 o'clock and worked for 3 hours alongside Bert and Clara and Senora Vasquez's eldest daughter, Rosa, making sure every detail was right. The hall, by 9:30 in the morning, looked like something from another world than the dusty Main Street outside. The blue and gold lanterns caught the morning light from the windows and threw small colored shadows onto the muslin tablecloths. The wildflower garlands were still fresh from Rose's damp cloth treatment, deep purple and cream and gold against the white of the walls. Clara's cake sat at the center of the longest table on its board, surrounded by the contributions that had been arriving since early morning, the Abbott family's cornbread stacked on a platter, a dish of preserved plums from the Reverend Morrow's wife, a pan of sweet potato pudding from me herself, tamales from Senora Vasquez in a covered pot that perfumed the whole room, 2 kinds of pie from households Alfred could not even account for because people had simply heard and brought things. Because that was what Callow Creek did when it was being its best self. People began arriving at 9:45, dressed in their Sunday best or close to it, the children scrubbed and briefly cooperative, the adults carrying plates and talking in the low, excited way that precedes a surprise. Amos Craw arrived exactly on time in a clean coat, as promised, and took a seat at the back of the room and folded his hands on his knees and looked around with an expression that might, if you were charitable, be called appreciation. Alfred stood at the door of the church hall at 5 minutes to 10 and watched the road, and at exactly 10 o'clock, he saw me Hendricks coming down the main street with Maggie beside her, both of them walking at the unhurried pace that meant me was talking about something, probably the imaginary ledger problem that had occupied Maggie's morning. He watched her come. She was wearing a dark blue dress he had not seen before, the blue of deep water, with her hair up in its usual pins, and she was listening to me with the polite attentiveness she gave everyone. And then me steered her gently toward the church, and Maggie looked up and saw Alfred standing in the doorway of the hall, and she stopped walking. Me, with the tactical wisdom of long experience, kept going and slipped past Alfred into the hall, leaving the two of them standing on the church path in the October morning. Maggie looked at Alfred. Her expression was very careful, the way it was when she was managing something large. Me did not actually need help with her ledgers, she said. No, Alfred said, she did not. Maggie looked at the door of the hall, from which a murmur of voices and the first tentative notes of Pete Navarro warming up his fiddle were escaping. She looked back at Alfred. You did this, she said, and it was not a question. I did, he said. The whole town helped, but yes, I am responsible for it. She said nothing for a moment. The October wind moved a strand of her hair across her face, and she did not brush it aside. You heard what I said to Bert Cowley, she said. Yes. I was not asking for anything, she said, and her voice was careful and controlled, and he could hear underneath it the thing that the care and control were working very hard to contain. I know you were not, Alfred said. That is why I did not wait to be asked. The silence between them lasted long enough that he began to worry he had misjudged everything, that she was angry or embarrassed or both, that the whole thing had been an overreach, that he should have simply said something quietly to her rather than involving 40 people and a 3-layer chocolate cake. He held still and held her gaze and waited. Then Maggie Rhodes, who was the most composed person he had ever known, pressed her lips together very briefly and looked away toward the far line of hills at the edge of town, and he could see her blinking. And she took one deliberate breath and then looked back at him. And the control was still there, but something else was there too, something that she was not, for once, trying to keep him from seeing. I do not know what to do with this, she said quietly. I have never had to know. You do not have to do anything, Alfred said. You just have to go inside. She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, Alfred, just his name. And the way she said it, with that particular weight, told him more than she probably intended to, told him that the wanting had indeed always been there, exactly as he had thought, and that no one had ever given her a reason to let it show. Go on, he said gently. They are all waiting for you. She went in, and the hall erupted with a sound that he had not quite anticipated, which was the sound of 40 people, some of whom were practically strangers to each other, all turning toward the door at once and calling out a birthday greeting with the unified warmth of a community that has remembered, in the act of doing something for someone else, exactly what it is for. Maggie stopped in the middle of the room and looked around her, at the lanterns and the garlands and the people. And Alfred watched from the doorway as she took in Clara's cake with its careful inscription, and the Harmon sisters beaming at her from behind their table of contributions, and Senora Vasquez, who came forward immediately and took both her hands and said something to her in a mix of Spanish and English that made Maggie nod and swallow, and Reverend Morrow, who clasped her hand warmly and told her the hall was hers for as long as she wanted it. Pete Navarro began to play, the waltz he had practiced, and it filled the room with something that changed the air in there, that made the morning feel ceremonious and right. Alfred came inside and stood to the side for a while, because this part was not about him. This part was about Maggie having the experience she had never had, and he wanted her to have it fully, without the complication of his presence directly beside her. He watched her move through the room, watched her speak to the Abbott family and to old Amos Craw, who stood up when she approached and offered her his hand with a dignity that Alfred thought spoke well for the old man, and to the children who had made her a card, a large piece of brown paper covered in careful childish writing that said, in a dozen different hands, "Happy birthday, Miss Rhodes." She read that card standing in the middle of the hall with the fiddle playing and the lantern swaying slightly in the draft from the open door, and she held it against her chest for a moment when she had finished reading it. And Alfred, watching from across the room, felt that thing move in his chest again, that complicated wordless thing that had no name he knew. Eventually, she found her way to him, because the room was not so large that she could avoid him, and also because he thought she was looking for him, though she did it with a casualness that was entirely characteristic of her. She stood beside him at the edge of the room and looked out at the party happening around them, the children chasing each other between the tables while their parents pretended not to notice, Pete playing something livelier now that had a few people tapping their feet, Clara cutting the first slices of cake with the focus of a surgeon while Bert Cowley narrated the process with his customary enthusiasm. "It is too much," Maggie said beside him. "Is it?" Alfred said. She was quiet for a moment. "I mean that it is more than I knew how to expect," she said. "I do not mean I want it to stop." "Good," he said. "Because I do not think Clara Finch would allow it to stop until that cake is finished." Maggie almost smiled. He had come to learn that almost smile in the months of watching her, had come to know it as one of the truest things about her, the expression she wore when she was genuinely amused but was not quite sure she had earned the right to show it fully. "Why did you do this?" she said then, and she asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without deflection. Alfred considered the honest answer. He had several to choose from. He could say because no one should go 24 years without anyone marking the day they were born. He could say because he had heard what she said to Bert and it had not left him alone. He could say because it was the right thing to do, which was true. But none of those were quite the whole truth, and Maggie, of all people, deserved the whole truth. "Because I could not stand the thought of you thinking you were the kind of person who did not deserve one," he said. She looked at him. The October light was coming through the lanterns and making everything gold, and Pete's fiddle was warm in the background. And all around them, 40 people were eating and laughing, and doing the ordinary things that make up celebration. And Maggie Rhodes looked at Alfred Redmond with those dark eyes that had always paid such careful attention to the world, and this time what was in them was not careful at all. "That is not why," she said softly, and she was not correcting him exactly, but she was seeing through to the rest of it because she had always been good at that. "No," he said equally softly, "that is not the only reason." The moment held between them like something suspended, like the moment before a first rain when the air is full of the promise of it, and all you can do is stand still and wait for it to arrive. And then Hendricks appeared at Alfred's elbow with a plate of tamales and 2 pieces of chocolate cake and said, with the cheerful authority of a woman who has waited long enough and will not wait any further, "You two will sit down and eat this cake right now. And Alfred Redmond, if you have not told this woman how you feel about her by the time that cake is finished, I will tell her myself and I will be much less romantic about it." Alfred took the plate. Maggie took her plate. They sat down at the end of the long table in the gold October morning, and they ate Clara's remarkable chocolate cake with its sugar flowers and its careful inscription. And around them Callow Creek celebrated and Pete played his waltz. And Alfred told Maggie how he felt about her in words that were direct and simple and entirely his own, without flourish or performance, the way that honest men say honest things when they have finally stopped waiting for a better moment. He said that he had been watching her for 6 months because she was the most genuinely interesting person he had met in a long time, that he admired the way she worked, and the patience she gave her students, and the humor she let show only sideways, that he had thought about speaking to her formally a dozen times, and each time had found a reason to wait, and that hearing what she had said in Bert's store had made him understand very clearly that waiting was a luxury he had already used up more than his share of. Maggie listened. She ate her cake and she listened to him with the full, undivided attention she gave everything that mattered to her, and when he had finished, she set down her fork with a precision that he recognized as her working out what she was going to say. "I have thought about it as well," she said, "about speaking to you, about what it might mean to let someone in. I have not had much practice with that." "I know," Alfred said. "I am warning you," she said, and her tone was so direct it was almost funny, except that it was also entirely sincere. "I do not know how to be easy about things like this. I will overthink it, and I will not always say what I mean immediately, and I will sometimes need more time than seems reasonable to trust something that looks good." "I know," Alfred said again. "You know," she repeated with a quiet skepticism. "I have been watching you for 6 months," he said. "I know how you are. I like how you are." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, Alfred Redmond. Then we will try." It was not the most romantic declaration ever made in the history of the Wild West, which had produced some genuinely extraordinary ones. But it was made by Maggie Rhodes, which Alfred thought made it the most significant one he had personally heard, and he felt the smile come to his face before he could do anything about it. And she looked at him and let hers come too, the full one, not the almost. And it changed her face entirely into something that was so warm and unguarded that he had to look away for a moment, because it was, if he was being honest with himself, almost more than he knew what to do with. Pete played on. The lantern swayed. Clara was persuaded by enthusiastic consensus to cut a second round of cake. Old Amos Craw, in a development that no one entirely predicted, was discovered in animated conversation with Senora Vasquez about the history of land grants in southern Texas, a subject on which he turned out to have strong and well-informed opinions. And Senora Vasquez, who had her own strong and well-informed opinions on the matter, was treating him with the exact level of respectful argument that he had always needed and never received. Reverend Morrow performed an impromptu short blessing for Maggie at her request, which she asked for with a directness that charmed him, and the children finally prevailed on Pete to play something they could dance to, which he did with good humor, and the morning stretched into afternoon with the particular generous looseness of time when no one wants it to end. The party finally drew to a close in the middle of the afternoon, when families began gathering their children and their dishes, and making their way home in the long golden light of an October afternoon. People said goodbye to Maggie with the warm sincerity of a town that has discovered it is fonder of someone than it quite realized, and Maggie shook hands and accepted thanks for coming with a composure that was, Alfred could see, genuine rather than performed, a composure not of suppression, but of actual settled feeling. When the last family had gone and Pete had packed up his instruments, and Clara had covered the remaining cake for me to take home, and Bert had retrieved his lanterns with careful rolling, and Senora Vasquez had gone with the comfortable dignity of a woman who knows she has been essential, Maggie and Alfred were left in the empty hall in the quiet of the late afternoon with the garlands still on the windowsills, and the tables still dressed in their ivory muslin. Maggie walked slowly around the empty room, trailing one hand along the edge of a table, looking up at the lanterns, and Alfred watched her from the doorway. She stopped at the table where Clara's cake had been, where only a few crumbs remained on the board, and looked at the place where the inscription had been. "First of many," she said softly, reading what was no longer there. "That is what Clara wrote," Alfred confirmed. Maggie looked around the room one more time at all of it, and then she looked at him in the doorway. "First of many," she said again, and this time she was not reading it. She was agreeing to it. They walked out of the hall together into the deep October afternoon, and Alfred fell into step beside her, and she did not move away, and they walked through Callow Creek in the long slanting light, talking about nothing in particular, about Douglas Crane's progress with his reading, and about the section of fence Alfred had repaired yesterday, and about whether there would be an early frost this year. And the nothing in particular was the easiest thing Alfred had ever done, easier than any fence, easier than any spooked horse, easier than any of the difficult things he had taught himself to do in 28 years of working out who he was in a world that did not always make room for it. In the weeks after the birthday party, Callow Creek did what small towns do when something has shifted in the atmosphere between two of their own, which is to make room for it while pretending not to notice. Alfred called on Maggie formally, as the conventions of 1882 required, presenting himself at Me's front door on a Sunday afternoon with his hat in his hands and his boots clean, and the direct, unperformative manner that Me later described to her sister as about the most straightforward courtship I have ever seen, which, considering the alternatives, is the highest compliment I can give. Maggie received him in Me's front parlor with equal directness, and they talked for an hour and a half about things that mattered to both of them, about education, and about whether the railroads were a net benefit or a net harm to the smaller communities they passed through, about the injustice of the laws that governed land rights for the Mexican families who had been on that land for generations before Texas was Texas, about which of the books in Alfred's small collection he thought she would most enjoy, about what Gus Holt was like as an employer, about her childhood in Missouri and his in Tennessee, and when Alfred finally stood to leave, Me appeared in the doorway with the timing of someone who has been in the hallway and is not remotely ashamed of it, and said it was time for supper and would Alfred stay, and Alfred stayed. He was there most Sundays after that. And on Thursday evenings he would sometimes stop by the schoolhouse as she was closing up the reading class, and they would walk back to Me's together in the dark, and if it was cold, she would sometimes take his arm, and he would feel the pressure of that through his coat sleeve like a specific kind of weather that he had not known to prepare for. He asked her, one Thursday in November, whether she had ever thought about what she wanted beyond teaching. He asked it carefully, not wanting to imply anything about whether she should stop teaching, because he knew how much it meant to her, and because he had seen too many women in the territory lose the things that made them who they were when they married men who needed them to be simpler. He was asking something more fundamental than that. He was asking what she dreamed of. She thought about it for a while in the way she thought about things, fully and without hurry. A home that is mine, she said finally, not rented. Not belonging to someone else. Somewhere I can plant things and know I will be there to see them come up. She paused. And someone who does not need me to be less than I am. I have no interest in you being anything less than you are, Alfred said. For the record. She looked at him sideways in the dark November air. You say that now, she said, but her tone was not cynical exactly. It was the careful wariness of someone who has learned to wait for evidence before believing in promises. I plan to keep saying it, Alfred said, until you believe it. She said nothing, but she held his arm a little more firmly for the rest of the walk, and that was, he decided, an answer of a kind. November moved into December, and December brought a blue norther that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an afternoon and coated Callow Creek in a thin layer of ice that nobody had entirely expected, and which caused a considerable amount of creative language among the ranchers trying to get their cattle under cover. Alfred worked 17-hour days for a week and looked, when the cold finally broke, like a man who has been used hard and knows it, and Maggie appeared at the Holt Ranch on a Saturday morning with a covered dish of beef stew and a clean bandage for the cut on his hand he had gotten from a frozen latch. And Gus Holt watched her pull up on the borrowed horse and walk to the bunkhouse door and said to nobody in particular, "That is a woman who knows her own mind." With the satisfaction of a man watching a situation resolve correctly. Maggie found Alfred in the barn because Gus directed her there, and she came in out of the cold with the stew under her arm and stopped when she saw him, leaning against a stall door with his eyes half closed in the way of someone who has just sat down for the first time all week. And he looked up when she came in, and something in his expression, in the unguarded tiredness of it, made her set the stew down on the nearest clean surface and go to him without preamble. She took his injured hand and unwrapped the dirty bandage and cleaned the cut with the carbolic solution she had brought in her pocket and wrapped it with the clean bandage in the quiet, efficient manner of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. And Alfred let her do it and watched her face and thought that he had never in his life felt so entirely taken care of. "Thank you," he said when she was done. "You would have let it go another week," she said. "Probably," he admitted. She looked up at him then, close enough that there was almost no distance between them at all, and the barn was warm and smelled of horses and hay and the cold that had come in on her coat, and Alfred thought that if there was a moment in his life that deserved marking the way the 15th of October had deserved marking, this was quite possibly it. "Maggie," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was looking at him with those eyes that never pretended. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to take as long as you need to answer, because I am not going anywhere regardless of the answer, and I want you to know that before I ask." She waited, perfectly still. "Will you marry me?" Alfred said, and it was simple and unadorned and exactly what it was. The pause that followed was long enough to make the horses shift and the barn timbers creak in the winter wind. He held her gaze. He held it and held it. "Yes," she said, "I will." And then, because she was Maggie, she added, "with the understanding that I keep teaching." "Of course," Alfred said immediately. "And that you never again spend a week with an infected hand because you were too busy to stop for 10 minutes. That is a fair condition," he said. "And that we plant things," she said. "In the spring, whatever kind of home we find, there will be a garden." "We will plant an entire field if you want," he said. And she looked at him with the full smile, the real one, and then laughed, an actual laugh that he had heard maybe 3 times before in all their months together, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. They were married in February of 1883, in Reverend Morrow's church, which was cold because the heater had a disagreement with itself that morning, and the Reverend's wife kept a running apology for the temperature throughout the ceremony, while simultaneously trying to keep the flower arrangements from wilting in the frost. Maggie wore the blue dress she had worn to her birthday party, because it was her best, and she saw no reason to pretend to a bride white she did not feel. And Alfred wore his good vest and the dark shirt and polished boots, and they stood in front of Reverend Morrow in the cold little church, and said what they meant in voices that the cold made visible, small clouds of breath that rose and dispersed in the chill air like the words themselves briefly made tangible. The whole town came. Amos Cross sat in the third pew and looked appropriately moved. Senora Vasquez brought tamales again, which everyone agreed was the right decision. Pete Navarro played the waltz from the birthday party as Maggie came up the aisle, and there was a small communal intake of breath from the room that recognized the reference. And Maggie heard it and kept her face straight, but her eyes were not helping her, and that was all right. Mee Hendricks wept openly and without any apparent embarrassment and pressed a handkerchief into Bert Cowley's hands when she realized she had used hers. And Bert, who was also a little watery about the eyes, accepted it with murmured thanks. Gus Holt stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands and watched Alfred say his vows with an expression that would have taken a skilled portraitist to capture accurately: pride and satisfaction, and the particular tenderness of an older man watching a younger one get something exactly right. Alfred had, in the weeks before the wedding, purchased a small parcel of land on the western edge of town from a family who was moving back east. 2 acres with a house that needed work, but had good bones, and a south-facing yard that Maggie had walked through twice already, with the measuring eye of someone planning a garden. He had spent the evenings after work over the past 3 weeks repairing what needed repairing, replacing a bad section of porch railing, fixing the window that would not close all the way, laying new floor planks in the kitchen where the old ones had rotted. And Gus had come out 2 evenings to help without being asked, and they had worked together in companionable quiet, the way of men who do not need to make conversation to be good company. After the wedding and after Mee's parlor celebration, which went until well past a reasonable hour, Alfred and Maggie went to their house for the first time together. It was February and cold, and Alfred had come out in the afternoon to lay a fire in the hearth so the house would be warm when they arrived, and when Maggie walked through the front door she stood in the warm parlor and looked around at the repaired window and the clean floor and the fire going in the hearth and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You fixed the window." "It was letting in a draft," Alfred said. She turned and looked at him in the firelight, and she had that particular expression she wore when she was full of something that she did not yet have the words for. And Alfred crossed to her and took her hand, the unbandaged one, just took it and held it. "Welcome home," he said. In the spring they planted the garden, as promised, in the south-facing yard with the good light. Maggie had seeds she had ordered by mail in February, and had been waiting for with an impatience that Alfred thought was charming, because she was so rarely impatient about anything. They spent a Saturday in late March turning the soil together, Alfred with the heavier work of breaking the ground and Maggie with the precise, careful planting, her hands moving over the earth with the same specific attention she gave everything she cared about. She planted tomatoes and squash and 3 kinds of beans and a row of sunflowers along the fence because she had always wanted them, she said, without further explanation, and Alfred thought that said everything that needed saying about what a garden meant to a woman who had spent 24 years in other people's houses. The sunflowers came up in June, big and gold and very slightly ridiculous in their cheerfulness, lining the fence in a blaze of color that people stopped to look at when they passed on the road. And Maggie stood at the kitchen window the morning they opened fully and watched them with an expression that Alfred, coming up behind her with 2 cups of coffee, recognized immediately. He gave her her cup and stood beside her, and they looked at the sunflowers in the June morning, and after a while she said, "I did not expect to be this happy." She said it with a slight note of surprise, as though happiness at this scale was a country she had heard described but had not quite believed in until she found herself standing in it. "You deserve to be this happy," Alfred said. She looked at him sideways. "You keep saying things like that," she said. "I will keep saying them until they are not surprising anymore," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, briefly, in the way she had developed over the months of their marriage. These small, deliberate gestures of closeness that meant more from Maggie than declarations from anyone else because they were chosen rather than habitual. Then she straightened and drank her coffee and said they needed to talk about whether to expand the bean row before the summer heat set in, and they talked about the beans, and it was exactly as good as everything else. By the fall of 1883, when the first anniversary of her birthday party arrived, Maggie was expecting their first child. She was 3 months along and had told Alfred in September with her characteristic directness, sitting across from him at the kitchen table after supper and saying, without preamble, "We are going to have a baby in the spring." Alfred had sat very still for a moment and then said, "Are you well?" Because that was the first thing, and she had said yes, thoroughly, and he had reached across the table and taken her hand and held it without saying anything else for a moment, and she had let him. The October 15th of 1883 was different from the year before in the way that everything was different now, saturated with the specific quality of a life being built. Alfred organized the party again, because he had told her first of many and he had meant it, and this time Maggie knew it was coming and helped plan it, which he thought was both more efficient and significantly more enjoyable than the first version. They held it in the church hall again, but larger this time, because word had spread to some of the surrounding farms and homesteads, and the guest list had grown organically. The way things grow in communities that have decided something is worth repeating. Pete played, Clara baked, Bert brought lanterns, and the Harmon sisters brought garlands, and Senora Vasquez brought tamales, and Amos Craw came again and sat in the same seat at the back, and this time spent the whole afternoon in conversation with Douglas Crane, who had graduated from Maggie's reading class in August, and had brought in the newspaper he had read by himself that morning with the pride of a man who has crossed a river he had thought was uncrossable, and whom Maggie had embraced. When he told her, in a brief and fierce way that had made him straighten his spine and look a full inch taller. At the end of the evening, when the hall was quiet and the lanterns were being taken down, Maggie sat at the table with her hands around a cup of warm cider, and watched Alfred stack the clean dishes with the easy efficiency that she had come to love about him. The way he moved through practical work with complete and unself-conscious competence. And she thought about the woman she had been a year ago, standing in Bert Cowley's store saying birthdays were not something we marked, and she could hardly recognize her. That careful, contained person who had made her peace with so many forms of absence. "Alfred," she said. He looked up from the dishes. "Thank you," she said, "for last year. For gathering the whole town without asking me." She paused. "I would have said no if you had asked." He came and sat down across from her. "I know," he said. "That is why I did not ask." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had always paid such attention. "You knew I would have said no. You had 24 years of practice saying no to things that were good for you," he said gently. "I thought one time of not being given the choice might help." She sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "You were right." And she said it the way she said things that were genuinely true, without decoration, and he understood it was the highest compliment she knew how to give. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a Monday after a Sunday of considerable and educational drama that Alfred had been inadequately prepared for despite his extensive experience with difficult calving seasons, which it turned out was not equivalent preparation in the ways that mattered. Dr. Pierce delivered the baby with calm authority, and Mee Hendricks was in attendance as she had announced she would be without anyone asking, and Maggie was extraordinary in the way that Alfred would later try to describe to Gus Holt and find inadequate words for, which he attributed to the fact that words were genuinely not sufficient. They named the boy Thomas Edmund Redmond, Thomas for Alfred's father, who had died when Alfred was 16, and whom he had loved without having been able to say so adequately while the man was alive, and Edmund for a schoolteacher Maggie had known in Missouri, who had been the first person to tell her that she was genuinely intelligent, and to act as though this was a fact that obligated the world to do something for her. Thomas was a loud and enthusiastic baby who had Alfred's green eyes and Maggie's specific intensity, concentrated in a small person of tremendous opinions, and he was adored by the entire town of Callow Creek with a comprehensiveness that Maggie found both touching and occasionally overwhelming. Mee Hendricks, who came every Tuesday afternoon, declared him the finest baby in 3 counties. Senora Vasquez brought food. Clara Finch brought a small cake for the week Thomas turned 1 month old, not a birthday cake, she clarified, but simply a cake in recognition of the achievement, and nobody argued with her. Alfred held his son in the early mornings when Thomas was fussing and would not be settled, walking the small kitchen in the dark with the baby against his shoulder, and Maggie would hear them through the wall and lie still and listen to Alfred talking quietly to the boy, telling him about the ranch and the horses, and what the weather looked like for the week, and what kind of man his grandfather had been. Just talking. The low, even voice that settled horses and had, she had discovered, the same effect on herself in difficult moments, and she would fall back asleep with a feeling in her chest that she had not had a word for, until she understood it was the specific feeling of being home. The years of the 1880s moved through Callow Creek with the particular texture of time in a place that is both changing and staying the same. The railroad brought new people, new goods, new arguments, and new music from the saloon on Saturday nights. The school grew, and Maggie hired an assistant teacher in 1886, a young woman from Kansas named Helen who arrived with a trunk full of books and a nervous energy that Maggie mentored with the patient precision of someone who has learned that being good at something is only half the obligation. The other half is passing it on. The land rights question that Alfred and Maggie had argued about over their Sunday dinners for 3 years came to a partial resolution in 1885, when a land commissioner came through the territory, and Maggie organized a petition from the Spanish land-grant families, written in both English and Spanish, which she submitted through the telegraph office to Austin with the full expectation of a fight, and the dogged follow-through of someone who has never believed that the absence of immediate results means the effort was wrong. The resolution was partial and imperfect, because these things always were, but the Vasquez family retained their eastern acreage, and Senora Vasquez came to Maggie's kitchen with tamales and sat at the table for an hour, saying nothing in particular with the specific eloquence of a woman who has too much to say to begin. In the fall of 1886, Maggie had their second child, a girl they named Clara after the baker who had put the words first of many in sugar on a birthday cake and who wept, when told, with a thoroughness that required Bert Cowley to surrender a second handkerchief. Clara Redmond came into the world with dark red hair and a temperament that was, from the very beginning, volcanic in its enthusiasms and its protests, which Alfred observed was the precise combination of both their characters meeting in an 8-pound person and producing a kind of concentrated force that was going to be interesting to raise. Maggie looked at her daughter in the first hours and said, with complete sincerity, "She is going to be remarkable." And Alfred, who was holding Thomas, now 2 years old and deeply unimpressed with the new baby, said he did not doubt it. The October 15th of every year remained a fixed point in the calendar of Callow Creek, the way certain things become fixed in community calendars not by official declaration, but by the gravity of their own rightness. People simply knew, as the second week of October arrived, that there was a birthday party to attend and to contribute to and to show up for. And they did, year after year, with the reliability that communities show for the things they have decided matter. By 1888, when Maggie turned 30, the party had grown to include not just Callow Creek proper but farms and homesteads for 10 miles in any direction, and the church hall could no longer hold everyone, and they held it in the open air behind the hall in the warm October afternoon, and Pete Navarro, who had acquired 2 additional musicians over the years, played until the stars were out, and some of the children were asleep under the tables. Maggie stood that evening in the midst of it all, in the October air that smelled like cedar and wood smoke, with Thomas, 4 years old, asleep against her shoulder, and Clara, 2 years old, sitting at her feet with a piece of cake in each hand and a look of absolute satisfaction on her face. And Alfred came and stood beside her and looked out at the people moving through the lantern light and the darkness and said nothing, because it did not need anything said. Maggie turned her head and looked at him. He felt it the way he always felt her attention, like a specific quality of light. "I think," she said quietly, "that you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Alfred looked at her. He thought about saying something equally large, but he had learned in 5 years of being married to Maggie Rhodes that the largest things were best said simply. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, "and you happened to yourself. I just showed up and tried to deserve it." She looked at him with the full smile, and Clara at their feet dropped one piece of cake and picked it up with the serene pragmatism of a 2-year-old who has decided the 5-second rule does not require apology. And Thomas shifted against her shoulder without waking, and the fiddle played on in the lantern-hung darkness. And all around them, the town they both belonged to moved through the autumn night, celebrating the birthday of a woman who had once thought she was not the kind of person who deserved one. By 1890, Alfred and Maggie had planted a third garden, because the first 2 had succeeded beyond what the original south-facing yard could hold, and the vegetable rows now extended around the side of the house and along the full back fence. The sunflowers came every June and had become, over the years, a kind of landmark for the house, the place people gave directions to by referencing the yellow house with the sunflowers, which would have delighted Maggie except that the house was not yellow. It was white, and she had to keep correcting people, but she never corrected the sunflowers part. Thomas, by then 6 years old, had developed a passion for horses that caused Alfred a level of pride so complete it was sometimes uncomfortable to witness, and had been given a small and extraordinarily patient pony named Biscuit, and spent most of his waking hours in negotiation with Biscuit about who was actually in charge of their relationship, a question that remained productively open. Clara, at 4, had Maggie's intensity applied to the project of learning to read, and had presented herself at the schoolhouse in September with the air of someone who intends to get as much as possible out of the available hours. And Maggie had looked at her daughter sitting in the front row on the first day with both hands flat on the desk and an expression of absolute focus, and had been struck briefly by a feeling so large it required a moment at the window to accommodate. Gus Holt retired from active ranching in 1889 and went to live with his daughter in San Antonio, and Alfred took over the management of the Holt Ranch under a purchase arrangement that Gus structured with a generosity that Alfred tried to argue against, and Gus refused to negotiate. Alfred was 35, and the ranch was his own now in the way that things are yours when you have built them from the inside rather than inherited them from the outside, and he ran it with the same steady competence that had always characterized him, hiring 3 regular hands and managing the land with a care for the soil and the grass that reflected everything he understood about what land means in a dry country. Me Hendricks, who had watched the whole decade of Alfred and Maggie from the vantage point of a woman who had predicted most of it, sold the boarding house in 1890 to a young couple from Ohio, and retired to a smaller house 2 streets from Maggie's, where she sat on her porch on warm evenings with the comfortable authority of someone who has earned her rest, and where Thomas and Clara visited her so regularly that she eventually built a small step stool next to her porch, railing specifically for Clara to climb up, which Clara accepted as her due. In the fall of 1890, on the evening of October 15th, which fell on a Wednesday that year and so was celebrated on the preceding Saturday, Alfred and Maggie sat on their porch after the children were in bed, and the party had been over for hours, and the night was warm enough to sit outside, one of those last warm nights of October that feel like the year giving you a parting gift before the cold comes properly. The stars were extraordinary, the way they always were out here, away from the lights of anywhere larger, and Alfred had his chair tipped back and his boots off, and Maggie had her feet up on the porch rail and her hair down, which she only did when the children were asleep, and they had been sitting in a comfortable quiet for 20 minutes. "What are you thinking?" Maggie asked. Alfred considered. "I am thinking about Bert Cowley's face the day I told him what I was planning," he said. "He looked like a man who had just been given a gift. He told me once that it was the best thing he had been involved in since his own wedding," Maggie said. And then he immediately said that was not counting his wife, who he was confident could not hear him from inside the store. Alfred smiled. The stars were very clear. "Do you remember what you thought?" he asked. "When you came down the street that morning and saw me in the doorway." She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through with the care she gave everything. "I thought you looked like a man who had done something he believed in without being completely certain it was right," she said. "And I thought that was the most honest I had ever seen anyone look." "I was not certain," he admitted. "I was afraid you would be angry." "I was afraid I was going to cry in front of 40 people," she said, "which I consider far more undignified." "You did not cry," he said. "I very nearly did," she said, "when I saw what Clara had written on the cake." He looked at her in the starlight. She was looking up at the sky with the expression that was not quite the contained thing anymore, not quite the careful guarded look she had worn when he first knew her, but something that had come open over the years gradually, the way certain flowers open, with a slowness that makes the opening more significant than the bloom itself. "I loved you," he said, "before that morning. But watching you walk into that room was when I knew I would love you for the rest of my life." She turned her head and looked at him, and the starlight made her face very clear. "I knew the same thing," she said. "When I understood that you had done all of that without asking me because you knew I would say no, that was when I knew." She paused. "That is the sort of knowing that does not change." He put his hand out and she took it, and they sat together on their porch under the October stars, In the house they had made into a home, with the garden asleep in the yard and their children asleep inside, and the town of Callow Creek quiet around them in the warm last night of October's grace. In December of that year, Maggie discovered she was expecting again, their third, and this time she told Alfred at the kitchen table as before, but with none of the careful composure of the first time. Simply said it over her coffee with the ease of someone delivering good news rather than a significant announcement. And Alfred smiled at her across the table in the morning light and said that was the best thing he had heard all week. And she said the week had only been 2 days old, and he said that was his point. Their third child, a boy they named Edmund Thomas Redmond, arrived in August of 1891, stout and serene where Thomas had been loud and Clara volcanic, with Alfred's dark hair and a pair of green eyes so definitive that the doctor laughed when he saw them. He was a calm baby who watched the world with an interested equanimity that both his parents found charming and slightly suspicious, as though he was taking very careful notes. The ranch did well through the early 1890s, the cattle market being cooperative and Alfred's management being sound, and they added 2 rooms to the house in 1892, so the children had more space, and the garden expanded again, and the sunflowers came every June. And every October 15th there was a party in Callow Creek that had become so thoroughly embedded in the town's identity that newcomers who arrived in September were immediately told about it by whichever established resident got to them first. The school expanded as well, with a second classroom added in 1891, and Maggie's evening reading classes had produced, by the early 1890s, a remarkable number of adults in Callow Creek who could read a newspaper independently, and she tracked their progress the way some people track investments, with attention and genuine satisfaction when the returns came in. Douglas Crane, who had been her first evening student, had by 1892 read his way through nearly everything in Maggie's own collection, and had begun requesting books through the mail, and she helped him compile his lists with the focused pleasure of someone who loves books and loves, equally, the experience of watching someone else discover them. Pete Navarro, who had played at the first birthday party and at the wedding and at every party since, married one of the Abbott daughters in 1889 and settled permanently in Callow Creek, and his music became one of the town's defining pleasures, the thing that made gatherings in Callow Creek different from gatherings in other places, that particular warm sound of a good musician who plays because it matters to him. Clara Finch kept baking cakes. Every October 15th, the cake was chocolate, 3 layers, with sugar flowers on top and the year written in careful lettering on the surface. The inscription changed each year, keeping the first of many promise without repeating itself, and Clara kept a list in her recipe book of every inscription she had used, which Maggie did not know about, and which Clara intended to show her someday when the list was long enough to be the gift it was intended to be. In 1893, when Maggie turned 35, Alfred gave her a gift in addition to the party, which he had not done in previous years because the party had always been the thing. But this year he had been working on something in the evenings for 3 months, which Maggie knew about because she was not easy to hide things from, but whose nature she had not been able to determine, and on the morning of her birthday he brought it out and set it on the kitchen table. It was a box, plain wood, made well but not ornately, and inside it, arranged in order, were 35 small cards, 1 for each year of her life. The first 7 were blank, because he had no way of knowing what had happened in those years, and he had decided that blank was truer than invented. But starting with the year she was 8, he had written on each card something she had told him over their years together, a fact or a story or an achievement from that year of her life, written in his direct handwriting without sentimentality, but with the specific care of someone who has listened hard to every story he has ever been told and kept what mattered. Year 8, learned to cook a proper supper on her own. Year 12, read the complete works of Shakespeare borrowed from the county lending library. Year 17, Earned money in summer to buy her own books for the first time. Year 21, teaching certificate. Year 24. Arrived in Callow Creek on a Tuesday in April with 3 trunks and enough determination to teach the whole territory. And then the years she had been his, written with the same economy and the same accuracy, and with a warmth in the accuracy that made economy feel like abundance. Maggie read every card at the kitchen table in the October morning while Alfred stood at the window and looked at the garden and tried to gauge her reaction without appearing to. When she had read the last card, she put it back in the box and sat quietly for a moment, and he turned from the window because the quiet had a particular quality to it. She was looking at the box with both hands flat on the table, the way Clara always sat with both hands on her desk when she intended to get as much as possible out of an experience. "You have been listening to everything I have ever told you," she said. "Yes," he said. "For 10 years." "Yes." She looked up at him, and he thought he had never seen her look quite like that, which was saying something, because he had spent 10 years paying attention to the way she looked. It was the expression of someone who has finally, fully, stopped being surprised by being loved and has simply settled into receiving it as what it is, which is the thing that had always been there, that she had always deserved, that the world had simply owed her a person to provide. "Alfred," she said. "Yes," he said. "Come sit down," she said. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where she had told him about Thomas and about Edmund, where they had talked about the school and the ranch and the Bean Rose and Douglas Crane's reading list. And she looked at him in the October morning light with those dark eyes that had always paid the world such careful attention. "I want you to know something," she said. "I am going to say it clearly because I think I do not say it clearly enough." He waited. "You gave me the first birthday I ever had," she said, without asking, which was right, because I would have said no. "And you have given me every one after it, and you have given me this house and this garden and our children and 10 years of someone listening to everything I said as though it mattered." She paused and steadied herself. "You have given me a life that I could not have imagined standing in Bert Cowley's store saying that birthdays were not something we marked, and I want you to know that I see it, all of it. And I am grateful for every piece of it, but more than grateful, I am changed by it in ways that are permanent and good." She looked at him straight and clear. "You changed me by showing up and believing I deserved good things before I was fully able to believe it myself." The October morning was very quiet, and the garden was golden through the window, and Alfred Redmond looked at his wife across the kitchen table and felt the full weight of everything they had built together. 10 years of daily, ordinary, extraordinary life, and thought that there was nothing in the world that he would not do again from the beginning. Every fence post and cold night and difficult week and beautiful morning, if it put him back here, in this kitchen, in this life, with this woman. "You would have gotten there on your own," he said. "Eventually, probably," she agreed. "But I am glad I did not have to." They sat together at the kitchen table, while the October morning grew full around them, and Thomas's voice came from outside, where he was working with his horses, and Clara's came from the parlor, where she was reading Edmund a story with the authority of a 7-year-old who takes narrative responsibility seriously. And the sunflowers were gone now, until next June, but the garden was still going in the way gardens go in October, winding down gracefully, leaving the framework of what will come again. That afternoon the town came, as it always came, and Pete played, and Clara Finch brought the cake, which read in the careful sugar lettering simply, 10 years and counting. And Maggie stood in the lantern-hung church hall in the October afternoon, with her husband beside her and her children underfoot, and the people of Callow Creek all around her. And she was, as she had told Alfred once on a June morning looking at sunflowers, happy in a way she had not expected to be. Not the happiness of someone who has been given something, but the happiness of someone who has understood at last that the giving was only the beginning, that what came after was built by both of them daily, in the ordinary and extraordinary accumulation of a life chosen and tended and grown. The cake was eaten. The fiddle played on. The lanterns swayed in the October air. And in Callow Creek, Texas, in the year 1893, the birthday of Maggie Rhodes was celebrated as it had been celebrated every year since a cowboy set down his coffee cup in the general store and heard a woman say, in a tone of deliberate peace, that birthdays were not something her family had marked, and decided without asking that this particular fact about the world was one he had both the ability and the obligation to correct. And it was good. It was very good. And it lasted.